Palworld came and knocked the gaming industry on its butt. What first seemed like another Pokemon clone came to be one of the biggest releases in the past few years. The open world survival game is simply fun at its core, which a lot of games in recent years seem to be missing the mark. There are a ton of things to do and see in the game which keeps players busy for hours. Though it has been a major success, the game still has flaws that make it clear that it's not a finished product, but there are high hopes that the developers use those newfound resources to continue polishing the game and giving the gaming industry something worthy of the history books. So, what is Palworld? It's an open world survival game that focuses on the mechanic of catching these creatures called pals, which you then use to defeat tower bosses. Now, if that idea of catching creatures sounds familiar, you'd be right. There happens to be the best-selling gaming franchise whose whole premise is set around catching monsters and doing battle with them, aka Pokémon. To be fair, when the developers of Palworld announced the release date, a lot of people called it Pokémon but with guns, which started this unofficial advertising that it was going to be a similar game to Pokemon Legend Arceus, but pointed toward a more mature audience. Besides the obvious similarities the game has to Pokemon, like catching creatures and how some of the creatures look, the two games couldn't be more different. At its core, Pokemon is a turn-based RPG, whereas Palworld is a survival game. So, if anything, it should be compared more to Ark, which is a survival game where you can tame dinosaurs and other creatures alike. Another fundamental difference is how pals are portrayed in Palworld. They are meant to be used as tools for the player rather than a partner you take with you during a long journey. This is made evident by the fact that you can butcher them, suggesting that your pals are replaceable. There were very few pals who I used in my playthrough that managed to stay relevant throughout the entire game. Most of the time, they were swapped out for something stronger or left at my base to help with a certain task like producing eggs. Looking at you, Chickapee. But don't get it twisted, you can definitely make a weaker pal strong. You just need to condense them and use pal essence to increase their attack and defense. One of the biggest differences between the two games is how breeding works. Breeding in Pokemon is more for fun or to try to get a certain nature on a Pokemon you want, but it isn't a big focus in the game. Unlike Palworld, where some of the best pals can be attained by breeding. The feature works differently in both games. In Palworld, you can breed any two pals, as long as one is male and the other is female, and you have a chance of getting a completely different pal than the two parents. Whereas Pokemon breeding requires two Pokemon from the same age group, then they need to be male or female, and they can only reproduce a child that is the first form of the female's line. Except a few species like Nidoran, where you have the chance to get the male version or the female version. At the end of the day, there are similarities between the two games, but there are way more differences. Enough about all that, let's talk about what makes Palworld such a good game. At its very base form, Palworld is a fun game where you get to play with your friends, discover new pals, build bases, and figure out ways to optimize those bases. Basically, this whole experience that I feel a lot of gamers have wanted for years from Pokemon, but instead it's in this entirely new universe for us to explore. The developers over at Pocket Pairs give gamers this huge playground to mess around in. There's so many pals to discover in this world and so many different kinds of biomes to uncover. With over 100 pals to find, there is plenty to see once you reached a new location. The game even has different variants of pals that pop up in different parts of the world. You might have a water pal near the ocean or the coast, and then you get near a volcano and see that same pal as a fire type. Pokemon has done this type of stuff before with different region variants, but it's just nice to see this in the first generation of this game. Now, unlike some games, the developers give the players plenty of unique options to get around. There are pals that you can graze the land on, pals that allow you to fly, and others that you can use as gliders. There's all these unique ways to traverse the world that give each player their own way to travel. Something I dove into during my playthrough of the game was the optimization of my base. My brother and I were always trying to figure out which pal we should use in order to make the base more efficient. For example, we were looking for pals that had better mining and lumbering skills so that we can get the most amount of wood and stone. Then we wouldn't have to worry when it came to crafting new weapons or structures, at least when it came to wood or stone. The really cool thing about this is that everyone runs their base differently. Some people like to run a more lenient business as the head honcho boss, while others are more attuned with being the master in the relationship with their pals, if you know what I'm saying. Something else you can do in the game that may be a little bit morbid is catching people. Yes, I mean you can catch the other NPC humans. Now, I know I couldn't have been the only one playing through Pokemon as a kid thinking that Team Rocket would stop selling Pokemon if only they knew how it felt to be captured in a small, spherical object. What? No one else? Just me? Forget that last sentence. But for real, the game allows you to let loose a little and do those GTA-like things in the game, which provides another level of fun for you and your friends. Let's talk about how this game was released on Xbox Game Pass. I know people have their opinions on owning or renting games, but this allowed so many people to try out the game. And if renting the game wasn't up your alley, it was only $30 when it first came out. And technically it had a release sale that was a few dollars off for people to grab, making it like $25 or $26. Either way, it is a cheap option compared to a lot of other games that have been coming out recently that are AAA $70 titles that don't really provide a great gaming experience. Looking at you, Suicide Squad. Unfortunately, the game isn't on PlayStation, which kinda blows for all you PlayStation players, but you guys have the honor to fight for freedom and democracy. What else do you need? There are so many fun and unique things that you can do in the game that just provide a good experience for the player. But that being said, there's still plenty of things that are wrong with the game. For instance, how tedious the game can be, especially when it first came out. Now, I have to talk about hatching eggs, because the whole system of breeding and hatching eggs is just so long and tedious for no reason. The process for pals to do the actual breeding can range anywhere from a minute to 3 minutes, which isn't too bad, but then you go to put the egg in the incubator. And I'm not lying when I say a large egg on hard mode took 24 hours. This wouldn't be an issue if this was 24 hours in game time, and maybe you got to skip some of that time which you slept through the night. But no, this is 24 real hours, as in the timer goes down by 1 second every single time you're in the game world, and if you're not logged into the server, then the timer doesn't go down. So you have to play an actual 24 hours in order to hatch a large egg, which isn't even the longest one. The original time in hard mode for a huge egg was around 40 hours, which is insane. Usually people would play the game in one session for maybe 4 hours. So in order for you to hatch one egg, it would take you anywhere between 4 to 10 sessions to hatch one egg. Luckily, they do have a slider in the settings that can change the amount of time you need to wait for an egg to be done incubating. But if you didn't know about this, it would be such a horrible experience. And for what? The only way it makes sense is for official servers that are running 24/7, but even then, the time it takes is still way too long. Eventually, they did make changes in a future patch that reduced the time drastically for all the game modes. I have to make one thing clear. I played the game on hard mode. That's just what I like to do. You can do whatever you want, but this next thing is especially an issue in hard mode, and I'm talking about catch rates. Honestly, I feel like the different spheres did absolutely nothing. Sometimes during the endgame, I would still struggle to catch some of the early basic pals like Lamball and Chickapee. I mean, I would throw a Gigasphere at those pals and they still had a chance to break out, which makes no sense. And tell me why I was never able to catch a Jet Dragon with a Legendary Sphere, which by the way is the best sphere you can craft in the game, and it only had an 8% chance to catch. But then I was able to catch one using an Ultra Sphere that only had a 3% chance? None of it made any sense. The catch rate felt more like an aesthetic than anything. On top of all that, you have your pals working at your base, and then for whatever reason, because of the conditions of your base, the pals can develop these weaknesses, which would end up slowing down their work process. You then need this medicine in order to get rid of these weaknesses, and some of the resources you need to make that medicine were tedious to get. Like incubating time, I think there should have been a setting that you could turn this feature off, as it was more annoying than anything else. Most of the time, I end up just replacing the pals that were weakened with their healthy counterparts. These are all just some things that didn't really make the game hard, it just made the game way more tedious than it had to be. And there should be an option in the settings that allows you to turn off or on these features. As this video was being made, they released a patch that actually fixed one of my biggest gripes with the game, which is not being able to name your pal. I thought that this was a little weird since most people would use it so they didn't get rid of a pal that they really liked, or one that had a really good passive ability on it like a fully condensed jet dragon that has all speed passives. But like I said, this was fixed, so it really isn't much of an issue anymore. I know the developers are hard at work trying to make these things better, but I still have to bring this up. The whole base mechanic and building mechanic just needs to be better. Like, why do the farms not have their own individual chests like the breeding stations do? Sometimes I'd get back to my base and it starts lagging out the whole game and I'm freaking out, and then I can see 1,000 wool on the ground, making the entire server super laggy. And on top of all that, the AI pathing for the pals in your base also needs improvement. A lot of times they get stuck in the most random places. Then they decide to get hungry because they end up not eating, and then they start starving, and the only way to fix this is to take them out of the base and into your pal box and then put them back in, which isn't hard, it's just frustrating and annoying. And of course, this wouldn't be a review if I did not bring up the amount of bugs and crashes that this game has. Now, to give them credit, it has come a long way in the past month, but there are still plenty of bugs that occurred during the game that can really take you out of the experience. For instance, I can open up the game and go to my multiplayer world and start it without the game crashing. The process I had to do was open up the game, go to another world settings, and then set that world to offline, then enter that world, then head back to the main menu, then go back to that world settings, set it to online, and then I would go back to the main menu where I can finally enter my multiplayer world. Again, I do want to give them credit where it's due, as the past month they have been working hard to try to fix these bugs and crashes. It's just been a slow process, which if you know anything about game development, you know changing one little thing can change a lot of things. So I understand, I do want to give them credit where it is due. Let's move on to some of the things the developers can do to improve the game. For instance, one of the main things they're working on right now is stability for the game. If you aren't the owner of the server or have a super system to run the game can be super laggy and buggy. When me and my brother were playing, he was able to do things I wasn't able to do and vice versa just because the game was so laggy at times. Like whenever we do the paraglide slide mechanic, I'm able to do it a lot easier, whereas he can fly off mountains and get crazy height that I can't do. They should also keep a solid line of communication with the community, as it will benefit them for getting feedback and loyalty from the players. Going radio silent would be the worst thing they could do, especially because they've gotten so much success in such a little time. The developers have released a roadmap that came out within the first week of the game's release, showing a lot of the future updates for the game. My hope is that they continue to fix bugs, but also include those new features like PvP and raid bosses a lot sooner rather than later. This will allow them to keep that momentum going and not allow for the gameplay to get stale. Now, this last thing that they should work on is more personal for me, as I'm an avid Hangyu user. A lot of people have noticed, including myself, that the glider pals are not impacted by the movement passives like other rideable pals are, which I think is totally unfair, because if this was true, then Hangyu would be one of the fastest pals to use in the game, even faster than Jet Dragon. All that being said, Palworld is a great game that you can jump in with your friends and mess around in. Yes, there are things that need to be worked on, but at the end of the day, it provides an overall fun experience for everyone. And if you managed to make it this far, you've earned yourself 55 XP coins.